Welcome to today's webinar, Unlocking Opportunity Zones for Equitable Outcomes, hosted by the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. My name is Michael Bayer. I am the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network and is partially funded by the U.S. EPA Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website, smartgrowth.org, that serves as your one-stop on the web for the most current information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. We provide news and information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Clearinghouse on smart growth topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We are recording this webinar and will post it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab later this week. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to get the latest news and information about smart growth and to learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also find out about planning initiatives and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association. To log your CM credits, visit the APA's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is Unlocking Opportunity Zones for Equitable Outcomes. You can also search for event number 9178330. This webinar has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. In today's webinar, we will talk about opportunity zones and explore some policy recommendations to ensure that they help to create inclusive and sustainable communities. So to get started, our speakers today are Christopher Coes and Stephanie Gidigbi. Christopher Coes is the Vice President of Land Use and Development at Smart Growth America. He oversees Smart Growth America's real estate programs, including Locus, which is Responsible Real Estate Developers and Investors, the Form-Based Codes Institute, and TOD Finance and Advisors, Inc., a for-profit subsidiary of Smart Growth America. Christopher has led Locus and Smart Growth America's national and regional planning, public policy, and advocacy efforts through a range of issues and accomplishments, including securing more than $20 billion in transit-oriented development and local infrastructure financing in the recent federal transportation legislation FAST Act. Under Christopher's leadership, Locus has become a national leader unafraid to tackle some of the toughest challenges facing the smart growth real estate industry. In 2014, Christopher launched the Attainable Housing and Social Equity Initiative, which has assisted local communities to develop place-based, market-driven strategies aimed at encouraging economic growth while ensuring accessibility and social equity in great walkable urban places. In addition to his work on transportation and real estate issues, Christopher has more than 15 years of experience in government relations, advocacy, and coalition building and program management. He received a BA and MA in government and politics from St. John's University, specializing in public administration. As Director of Policy and Partnerships with the Healthy People and Thriving Communities program at the National Resources Defense Council, Stephanie Gidigbi champions public policy solutions that promote economic, social, and environmental benefits for communities. She fosters strategic partnerships to advance federal campaigns, coalition efforts, social equity, and climate justice. She also coordinates NRDC's effort in advancing a federal plan for 21st century infrastructure investments and elevating social system change strategies as policy director for the Strong, Prosperous, and Resilient Communities Challenge, or SPARK, initiative. Stephanie began her career on Capitol Hill and served as a liaison for the Congressional Black Caucus International Task Force, coordinating the response for the 2010 Haiti earthquake recovery. Stephanie has more than a decade of international, federal, state, and local government experience working with elected business and community leaders. She holds a master's degree from Seton Hall University and is based in Washington, D.C. Following the presentations, our panelists will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime during their presentation by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. So now I'm going to turn it over to Christopher to get us started. Welcome, Christopher.
Good afternoon. I am Christopher Coes, Vice President at Smart Growth America, and I again want to thank everyone for allowing me to participate. Smart Growth America is a national nonprofit organization that empowers communities through technical assistance, advocacy, and thought leadership to create livable places, healthy people, and share prosperity. Locus is a national coalition of private sector real estate developers working to meet the country's pent-up demand for sustainable, equitable, walkable urban places by advocating for local, state, and federal policy change. This morning, I will provide a brief overview of the Opportunity Zone tax incentive and the investment and policy framework to promote more affordable housing, smart growth practices across the country. The National Opportunity Zone economic tax incentive is what is known as a national bipartisan supported concept that was included in the 2017 Tax Cuts Jobs Act. The overall tax incentive approach and theory of change is really to take the private sector approach to community development. How does it work? Right now, there's approximately over $8 trillion in unrealized capital gains. So think about your Google stock, land holdings, those that have appreciated assets that you have not actually capitalized. There are over $8 trillion of those dollars, and the tax incentive is to provide a level of incentive to those investors to transfer those dollars into low-income census tracts. Starting in early 2018, governors across the country, including U.S. territories of Puerto Rico, Guam, and Virgin Islands, were able to identify up to 20% of their low-income census tracts to be designated as an opportunity zone. Once those designations were certified by the U.S. Treasury, now opportunity zone investors with unrealized capital gains can now transfer those dollars into self-declared opportunity funds, which are allowed to invest in either businesses in opportunity zones or businesses that are purchasing property. So think real estate. These investors, as they invest in these opportunity zones, have the ability to take advantage of three specific tax benefits. First and foremost, for those who have unrealized capital gains, understand that one of the biggest elements is the capital gains tax. So during the period of an investment for up to 7 years, investors are able to defer that capital gains tax. There are three major benefits for investors who are interested in investing either in businesses, real estate, or businesses that are purchasing tangible property in opportunity zones. The first, as I mentioned, is the delay of their capital gains tax. As you're aware, if you sell your Google stock or your land holdings, you are subjected to a 20% capital gains tax. Those investors are able to defer that tax up till December 2026. The second benefit for those investors investing in opportunity zones through either businesses or property, also, if they maintain their investments in these low-income census tracts for at least 7 years, they are able to reduce their tax liability on their initial gain. For example, if you had a Google stock that had appreciation of at least $1,000, traditionally you would be subjected, your $1,000 would be subjected to a capital gains tax. In this model, investors who invested at $1,000 in an opportunity zone for at least 7 years can reduce their $1,000 tax liability to $850. If you do not invest in 7 years, but invest at least 5 years, you reduce your tax liability by 10% to where your $900 would be the tax liability. And the last tax incentive, which truly has been the main engine and excitement around the overall opportunity zone tax incentive, is the fact that an investor who invested their Google stock or their land holding in these distressed communities and kept those dollars there for at least 10 years, meaning if you invested at $1,000 and your $1,000 appreciated another $1,000, the additional increment, that additional $1,000 would now be tax-free. Now, one of the things we do know about opportunity zones across the country is that overall, opportunity zones represent a close to 12% of America's landmass, but more importantly, is home to over 30 to 35 million Americans, of which over half, if not close to 60%, are of minority populations. So overall, opportunity zone will be single-handedly the largest economic tax incentive to have an impact, not just on lower population, vulnerable populations, but people of color. In addition, given the fact that we are a smart growth network, one of the things that we are truly should be aware of is that only 9% of the current designated opportunity zones have at least one transit station, and that is defined by FTA's fixed guideway station. So think light rail, streetcar, passenger rail, high-speed rail, and BRT. Of course, for those of us who are also working in smart growth communities, recognize that oftentimes our challenges is about how do we ensure affordable transportation and affordable housing. One of the things that is to note that these zones, on average, residents in those zones spend a close to 53% of their income on housing and transportation. Here is just a basic side of how opportunity zones, particularly those funds, operate. So at the top, you see investors who have unrealized capital gains can, within 100 days, move those gains into a qualified opportunity fund, and which again is a simple corporation, so think an LLC. And within 6 months of the deployment of those dollars, the opportunity fund can either A, directly invest in new construction and new apartments and multifamily and commercial, or can invest in businesses. One of the main elements here is that this tax incentive has a time period. So as I mentioned before, if you're an investor, you have till 2026 before you have to pay your tax liability, and until 2041 to actually finalize your business operations and opportunity zones. So again, the quicker you get into the market, the more benefit you gain, and the longer you stay, the more benefit you gain. Now, for those, what can opportunity zones, particularly opportunity funds, support? Of course, affordable housing, infrastructure, commercial development, transit-oriented development, and as well as small-scale business retention. These are major opportunities for a smart growth community to really embrace opportunity zones. As you may be aware, Smart Growth America is a national nonprofit with a number of coalitions, including Locus and our first and main coalition of elected officials across the country interested in smart growth practices. As an organization, we were getting a lot of questions from our investment community as well as local officials in terms of better understanding what is happening in opportunity zones today and which zones specifically are best positioned to provide a triple bottom line return as well as a policy framework to achieve those returns. And so with that, Locus, in partnership with the George Washington University Center on Real Estate and Analysis, in close collaboration with Spark, we're able to do a national ranking system on opportunity zones. And I'll spend a few minutes just breaking down the report and some of the lessons we've learned from that report. Before I get started, one of the things that we do know at Smart Growth America and through a variety of research that we've done with the George Washington University is the way that we see the world in terms of the overall land use development of this country. The way we approach this conversation, essentially, we see the world as either walkable or non-walkable. And then here is just a simple 4-cell slide of how we do an analysis of the entire land use across the country based on some of the recent reports that we've done. One of the things that we did in 2016, which will be updated this year in a couple of weeks, we actually took an analysis of the top 30 metros across the country to gain a better understanding of where the real estate market, particularly in walkable communities versus driverless communities, was heading. And this is what we learned. If you were in a walkable urban place, a smart growth community, in the top 30 metros, we see that there has been a 72 price premium on real estate, and particularly in rents, whether it's an office, whether it's in retail, whether it's in multifamily. In all 30 metros, we saw walkable urban places get a rent premium. And in addition, we find that these metro places are market share for walkable urban places are only growing. What does this really mean? Well, if you're thinking about an opportunity zone project and you want to take the fullest advantage of the tax incentive, you want to be investing in places that get you higher rents. Now, with that, there comes, of course, a lot of challenges, and I'll talk about that later on in this presentation. But overall, we begin to understand that the real estate market wants to move towards more smart growth, more walkable, densely transit-oriented development locations, and wanted to see which opportunity zones across the country fit that model. Now, with that, as we began to develop this report, we were able to look at using our foot traffic ahead report data set, as well as some new data sets gleaned from the CDC and EPA. We began to realize that of the 7,800 opportunity zones across the country that we analyzed, that there was a specific opportunity zone typology. Now, again, when we did this research, we analyzed the opportunity zones' smart growth potential, as well as their social equity vulnerability. And with that, we identified three major typologies. First, there are opportunity zones that are established walk-ups, and we consider these places high risk for accelerated displacement. The second type of opportunity zone, in terms of the smart growth lens that I described earlier, is what we call bubble opportunity zones, bubble communities. These are places that generally have good or average smart growth potential and social equity scores, but with the right set of policies, whether it's increased funding in public transportation, whether it's increased funding in affordable housing, these places could really pop and become the next best smart growth community. However, these are also the same places that, if not done correctly in terms of investment or economic development strategy, i.e. Losing a factory, these are the type of places that we can naturally see decline over time in the lack of investments. And then lastly, of course, what we call potential walk-ups. For those of you who are familiar with the LEED and D, no community should be called a copper or lead, but the idea is that these are communities potentially who have, right at this point in time, very, very low walkability, very, very few affordable housing choices, and traditionally have been where majority of individuals are living and walk in a drivable sprawl. So with that being said, what do we learn? For one, we recognize that of the 7,800 opportunity zones that we reviewed, excluding the territories, Puerto Rico, Guam, and Virgin Islands, we were able to identify the most desirable triple bottom line smart growth investments across the country, but also we were able to identify by zone which opportunity zones were, while ideal for investment, were also most vulnerable to the market pressures for gentrification and unmanaged gentrification that leads to displacement. So what you see here is just a snapshot of the top 100 opportunity zones across the country that we, in our view, must be implementing do no harm policies today. At the same time, are also the best places for investors to achieve a smart growth investment. So, of course, Oregon, in terms of downtown Portland, downtown Oakland, downtown Seattle, and Newark, round out the top 4 and 5. Now, with that, one of the lessons that we also learned by our analysis is the fact that while we do have a significant portion of the population, and as you can see here in the top right-hand corner, high smart growth potential communities, that represents about 400,000, close to a little under 500,000 Americans who live in what we call truly high risk of displacement communities, while the majority of Americans live in what we classify as low smart growth potential and low social equity. Over 20 million Americans live in drivable sprawl. And one of the challenges that we have here, and what was really revealing from this research, is that we are now, when we talk about opportunity zone from a smart growth perspective, we recognize that we have to fight a two-front war. The first war front is the fact that we have to protect populations that are vulnerable to unmanaged gentrification, which leads to displacement. In addition, we're also really vulnerable to communities who have been long deprived from public resources, public inclusion, and the like, for actually getting investments that will only perpetrate and accelerate climate change and the production of more drivable suburban sprawl. And so from this standpoint, we recognize that this research really helps us craft a much more finite ability to target resources, policies, and ideas to those communities. And this is the next slide you'll see is just an example. I am from South Georgia, but I always adopt Atlanta as a third home. And here you'll see, as from our research, the ability to see how certain neighborhoods and opportunity zones land on the social equity vulnerability index and the smart growth potential. So if you, as you can see here, communities that have high smart growth investment potential, meaning they have great access to transit, great access to jobs, score really, really high. And here you'll see Centennial Park in that high right-hand corner. Centennial Park also has great social equity, great affordable housing. So that community, that particular opportunity zone is most threat for accelerated gentrification. Now, of course, in your lower left-hand corner, you have dozens of communities in the Atlanta region that we would want to target to make sure that their future investments actually improve affordable housing, improve transportation options. Of course, that is a conversation that we'll be having later on through Q&A about how we go about that. Now, what have we learned from the report? Number one, not all opportunity zones are created equal, and investors themselves should choose communities that articulate a clear strategic investment strategy. Two, because there's a short timeline to take advantage of the tax incentive, investors will be choosing places that have least resistance, zoning and regulatory. And from those of us in the smart growth community recognize that that means we have to make sure that our urban infill, our transit-oriented development planning and land use and community engagement are such that investors can move quickly. Otherwise, we recognize that greenfield development may actually be where a lot of investors go. Another element that we're finding is that investors, particularly those who are interested in opportunity zones, are looking for clear and underwritable projects, so shovel-ready projects. But more importantly, I think one of the major challenges that we are finding with opportunity zones overall is that, unfortunately, in the 2017 Tax Cut Jobs Act, there was no guardrails for reporting, for transparency, or community benefit. And so in many cases, investors are beginning to figure out how to encourage or incorporate equitable development in their investments. So those are some of the things that we're beginning to see from the investment community. But here are some simple principles that we should be thinking about when it comes to how should opportunity fund investments in opportunity zones should be founded upon. And so number one, location is extremely important. As I pointed out before, we're beginning to see signs of investors who are coming into communities who are really interested in doing revitalization of their rural downtowns or around transit centers are beginning to pick the greenfield locations. And so increasingly, we're trying to educating, whether it's through public sector or nonprofits, of the importance of location of these investments. Secondly, leveraging public and nonprofit controlled land for affordable housing is critical. Most recently, Zillow did an analysis of opportunity zones in comparison to other distressed communities that were not designated, and we're beginning to see that land costs in opportunity zones rose 20%. So if you're someone who had a home in an opportunity zone, your land value increased 20%. So that $100,000 home now is worth $120,000. So we're beginning to see the challenge to ensuring that we are able to bring affordable housing to opportunity zones as land costs increase due to speculation. Of course, protect existing affordable housing stock is paramount for our industry. The last two elements I would say is that one of the things we're beginning to see from the state level particularly and the local level is figuring out how to align existing state, local funding, and also federal dollars to support opportunity zones. Most recently, the White House has, through an executive order, created a national opportunity zone task force that will be designing and actually modifying existing federal grants and loan programs to make it easier for Opportunity Zone projects to get funding. And this is also being replicated by a number of states across the country, whether it's through their workforce training, through their LIHTC allocations, and other community development programs. And then lastly, we're beginning to see, I think one of the things we would like to see more of is the fact that communities need to be engaged in this conversation. Oftentimes, a lot of conversation around Opportunity Zone is that how do you get a project gap filled? But one of the things that we are being very mindful of is that there is a community gap. And oftentimes there's an element of ensuring that communities feel engaged, that they actually have a voice at the table. So the last three elements I think I will end on that people should understand from the report, and as well as some of the work that we are doing here at Smart Growth America, is that unlike traditional tax credits, the Opportunity Zone tax incentive does not change the gap in traditional projects. It actually diversifies the investors. So one of the things that we in the Smart Growth community have to do is better understand the actual gap, whether it's in a business that we want to small scale manufacturing in downtown areas or revitalizing rural places. We have to understand the gap of the project. And by knowing that gap, that allows us to think about more innovatively how we can potentially fill that gap, either bringing philanthropy or putting in CRA dollars and the like. But understanding the gap is fundamental to understanding how Opportunity Zone tax incentives can actually play in this space. Again, this particular program, this particular tax incentive does not close gaps. It does not make projects that wouldn't have penciled before pencil. It actually makes good projects better. And those good projects are ones that understand the gap. Secondly, if you learn nothing else, we have to protect the existing housing stock in our Opportunity Zones. So if communities have not taken inventory of existing housing, if they have not worked with owners who are landowners who want to revitalize, to make sure that they revitalize without displacing their existing residents. And lastly, making sure that existing homeowners, particularly elderly homeowners, are protected from the increased property taxes that we're seeing due to the speculation of Opportunity Zones. We're not doing ourselves any services. And then lastly, and I think this goes through our work, we have to right now, yesterday, ensure that in these Opportunity Zones that create the best opportunity to create more triple bottom line, smart growth communities, we have to change the land use and development policies, not just to support multifamily affordable housing downtowns, but also to ensure that do no harm policies, community benefit needs, and priorities are embedded. Because when a community has these things, the community and equitable development framework in place on the front end, it makes it easier for Opportunity Zone investor, business, or project sponsor to actually make a deal happen versus going to a greenfield development, because that's the dynamic we're in right now. So lastly, this is just a snapshot of some of the things that we're seeing cities do today across the country, whether it's creating online platforms, creating Opportunity Zone task forces, as well as creating an opportunity fund to target smart growth projects, to help local residents and the like. But with that, I will turn the rest of the presentation over to a dear friend and a colleague, Stephanie Gidigbi from NRDC.
So we actually put a couple poll questions here before, as Stephanie gets going, to ask of the participants here today about kind of their interest in this topic. So the first question that we have is who attending today is actively pursuing or actively planning in a community that is within an opportunity zone? And if you want to go ahead and you can select yes, I plan in an opportunity zone, or no, I do not. So we've got about 74% of those on here have voted, and 55% have said yes, and 45% have said no. Okay, so why don't we move on to the second question? So to kind of transition to the second part of our presentation, who attending is interested in developing equitable solutions to these issues we're talking about today? First, yes, I am, and no, I am not. And not surprisingly, for our audience today, it's about 96% or so that are yes. So with that,
that's awesome.
We'll go ahead and give the screen over to Stephanie. She can take over from here.
So first of all, I just want to thank the Smart Growth Network. I want to thank Christopher Coes and Michael for allowing me to participate in today's discussion about how we unlock opportunity zones for equitable outcomes. I'm really encouraged by the participation of folks on the call right now. We're looking at thinking about how we actually implement some equitable solutions. Okay, sorry all for the technical difficulties, but I promise it'll still be a great conversation. So today I'm hoping that we can talk a little bit about both Spark and some of the work that we are doing in communities across the country. Some of the work that we've been really looking at in terms of investment without displacement, highlighting some of the community-driven development that's focused on inclusive development and investment across the country. I will spotlight some toolkits and resources for advocates to consider thinking about. We will answer the question together, critical steps that advocates can take to understand the impacts of opportunity zones, how opportunity zones can actually benefit your community, and critical questions required to really advance equitable development. Since my colleague Christopher touched a lot about and gave a solid overview on what opportunity zones means, I wanted to kind of give an overview from the perspective of what our advocates are doing across the country. And I wanted to start a little bit based off of the work that we have been doing here at NRDC through an initiative called SPARK, the Strong, Prosperous, and Resilient Communities Challenge, which is supporting collaborative tables across the country in 6 regions, Atlanta, Chicago, Denver, LA, Memphis, San Francisco, the Bay Area. And we're providing both capital financing tools, policy expertise, technical assistance, and a cohort that we call a learning community. We are an initiative that comprises of enterprise community partners, the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, and the Low Income Investment Fund LIFT. Ultimately, we believe that across the country, we're seeing trillions of dollars being invested in the built environment, and there's an opportunity to really think about how we can make investments that ensure that everyone benefits. Ultimately, we believe that our goals can be shaped to ensure more just economic health and environmental outcomes for communities. We have several different models that we use as part of it. 4 of them include identifying catalytic moments in each of the region that are really triggers, but also opportunities for bold investment to do things differently, supporting diverse cross-sector tables, really leading with a thought process of systems change, recognizing that many of our policies are interconnected. So when you do something to one portion of the system, like transportation, it may have an impact to another, like housing. And really thinking about how we use data-informed decision-making, really being grounded in community-informed data, not from a deficit, but from an asset building to leverage community assets more boldly. Over the last 2.5, 3 years, one of the things that have brought all of us together, both at the national and local level, is honestly the threat of displacement in communities. And last fall, we had the opportunity to host a conference and convening that brought 300 folks from across the country, representing over 22.5 million Americans, to talk about what investment without displacement would look like and how we can identify some solutions for more equitable, healthy, and vibrant communities. We really believe that if we are going to do this work intentionally, it is a requirement for us to really think about how we not just organize, but how we catalyze and mobilize to really advance bold investments that really support communities. And so I'm going to highlight a couple of those pieces just so that you get a better sense of what we're talking about when we start to talk about opportunity zones and the possibilities. And then also tools that are happening across the country and advocates who are leading the way. Another key component for us before I go deeper is really just talking about our values. Oftentimes when we start to talk about investing in place, we don't really think about, first of all, who has been there. We often talk about communities as though people weren't there before investors arrived. And so how do we lead with our values and recognize the inequities that have happened and leverage the multiple tools that and strategies that can really allow for catalytic investments to support local community visions, and how do we use integrated approaches to really address both the racial inequities that we're seeing in communities across the country that can support better health outcomes and lead to more climate resilient solutions. And inherently, we really believe that if we're going to address these issues, it has to happen at a systems change level, going to the root cause of the challenge, addressing the legacy of racism that has shaped many of our countries across, many of our cities across the country, particularly when we think about our built investments. I often use the example of a pothole, and in part because when we were building out our interstate system 60 years ago, it was a different America that reflected our values of that era, one that was laced in a legacy of segregation, one that intentionally or unintentionally displaced communities in ways in which every time we fill that pothole, we are essentially reinforcing the inequities of the system of our past. And so how do we really ensure that we are building more transformative investments that build with our values of today? And how do we ensure that there is both a community-informed and community-driven approach to really thinking about the investments that we're making today so that we all thrive? And I'm excited because I think every time that we get a chance to really call out and name the challenges that we are trying to address, it allows us to get more clear about the solutions that we can do. So, one of my favorite projects right now is accessory dwelling units. And one of our great advocates, Renee Stone at the West Denver Renaissance Collaborative, is piloting a new approach to look at accessory dwelling units. And it's really an opportunity to address both involuntary displacement, but also an opportunity to build greater wealth for local communities. And essentially what both the ADUs and the initiative that they're offering is really thinking about how do you build a second home on your property. And this is an opportunity for those residents who are living in opportunity zones, are homeowners, and really trying to leverage and maximize the space, increase density in the neighborhood, and also to upgrade their current existing homes, particularly in many of our older communities, taking in account weatherization, the rehabilitation that's required as part of it, and also allowing for low-income homeowners to remain in the community. We have done a lot of work that really focuses on the impact of energy burdens when we talk about climate change, and the fact that many people are spending, particularly in places like Memphis, more on their utilities than any place in the country. And so it's critical that as we're making these investments, we're thinking about integrated solutions, and this is one of them. Another great example is happening in the Bay Area, and we are excited about the Oakland Community Land Trust. And really what they're focusing on is both community involvement and preservation strategies to reclaim economic opportunities for low-income residents. And they really have been using a land trust model that really both leverages those who are living in the neighborhood itself, but also targeting low-income community members who may be impacted by the increased property values for the region. I think this is really an opportunity to think about how, as a community or a neighborhood, you can anchor and stay in place as part of it. Another great example that we're seeing, and also to some extent, an area that could potentially lead to displacement, is the increase in public and open space. At NRDC, we think that everyone should have the opportunity to have access to parks and open space. We believe that it definitely leads to greater health investments. health outcomes. However, we also recognize that for a very long time, many of the park and open spaces, particularly in urban spaces, had often been under-resourced and underdeveloped. And so one of our great partners who sits at the collaborative table of LA Thrives, the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust, has been advocating since 2002 to address park inequities. They were part of a larger coalition that really helped to push Measure A, which was a park and open space ballot initiative in LA, to ensure both park and open space, but also affordable housing. And this is one of those emerging areas of opportunity similar to transit-oriented development in the early or late 90s, and work that continued on through folks like Reconnecting America and Transportation for America to really think about both land use policy as it relates to transportation and affordability. And similarly, we're seeing the impact of green spaces, private trails as opportunities to support more climate solutions that ensure greater benefits, but with the right mechanisms, build for, maintain, and address inequities of affordable housing for residents who are in those neighborhoods. And groups like the Southeast Asian Community Alliance are organizing not just residents who have been in the neighborhood, but also those who are going to be the next leaders for the neighborhood in organizing youth. Oftentimes when we start to talk about strategies, we forget both our seniors and we forget our young people as great folks who can help to be part of both the way that we organize, catalyze, and mobilize towards greater change. And then another spotlight before I go to resources and tools are some ideas of how you leverage community assets. Oftentimes when we're talking about communities, we speak from a deficit model, everything that they lack, everything that they need, but every community has an asset and it starts with their people. And one great example, really thinking about how you leverage community assets, is being able to support naturally occurring cultural districts. And I call out naturally occurring because there have been arts districts that have been formed in the past, but they were not led by the community. It was never, the community was never thought of in the process, and it was designed to attract art, which we believe is critical and one of the tools that we use within Spark, but not in an inclusive manner. And so being able to leverage some of the groups that a neighborhood may have, I believe, is a really great way to both build economic development, celebrate the cultural legacy of a community, and anchor the community through the investments that are made. And the Americans for the Art has an amazing toolkit that I would encourage folks to go and see and check out, that talks about how both you advance cultural districts, how you develop them, how you think about the basic 101s. More recently, for our last few convenings, we've had an opportunity to visit other places outside of our regions and also within our regions. And I wanted to highlight both Little Tokyo, which I think is a great example of using both preservation strategies, but economic development strategies to ensure that residents are able to stay and be anchored in place. When we start to talk about displacement, a large portion of the conversation is it's not about the investment of the neighborhood, but it's really the loss of identity. And being able to create cultural districts allows for the communities that have been there long before the investments were coming in to stay in place. Another great example is Little Africa in Minneapolis, which we had an opportunity to visit. Both them and the Hmong community have done some amazing work with along the Green Line, and I would say both the Twin Cities and Minneapolis have been very intentional about both setting aside resources to support the cultural districts, but creating economic engines and ensuring that the residents there are anchored in place through very holistic strategies. I could talk about this all day, but I know that's not what you're here for. You want to figure out how to do this right. And so I wanted to call on I'm going to highlight a couple of key groups who have already done the work for you, and I'm going to point you to their websites to talk about some of these pieces. The first one is the Association for Neighborhood Housing and Development. They've developed an anti-displacement policy toolkit. It's very much comprehensive, and they include policies that really focus on affordable housing preservation, really thinking about how you stabilize neighborhoods, how you think about community ownership models, how you support equitable development, and what tenant protections you should have in place. I think for all of the resources that I'm going to show in terms of potential policies to think about, the most important thing that I hope you hear from all of this is that a critical component to any policy is enforcement. The Urban Displacement Project, which is one of our data partners that we're working in with Spark, did a great study of LA, which had a lot of great anti-displacement policies, but many of which are not necessarily being enforced. So it's not just enough to advocate for the policies, it's also just as critical that they're actually being regulated and enforced. And advocates really have a role to play after they have helped to push for some of these policies to be in place, that they actually ensure that they're being enforced. And you're holding elected officials and the practitioners who are helping to really think about these pieces accountable to the things that we're saying in communities. Another great resource that has been around for years is actually the PolicyLink Equitable Development Toolkit. It includes like 27 different strategies. It includes case studies as part of it. And I would be remiss if I did not highlight the amazing work that's happening there. And they continue to provide updates through their newest initiative with All-In Communities. I also want to highlight some amazing work that my colleague Maria Zimmerman from MZ Strategies has been doing in focusing on both transit-oriented development and as part of Spark, released an issues brief as part of it. And since EPA is funding this amazing webinar, I wanted to also call your attention to their report. It was published a few years ago, but still amazing tools and resources that really highlight how you create equitable, healthy, and sustainable communities. Homeownership is critical, but in many communities, the majority of them may be renters, and the majority of them who may be low income are probably tenants as well. And so the struggle remains that even with the amazing investments potential that opportunity zones could offer, without tenant protections, the residents who are there can't benefit from it. So we want to make sure that there are tenant protections in place. And the folks at Rights to the City, Tenants Together, have done some incredible work. My colleague Sasha Forbes at NRDC has produced an issue brief that's focused on how you really think about tenant protections that really integrates climate vulnerability of housing, and also some of the health challenges that are happening in many unsecured neighborhoods where tenant protections are not put in place. And just to name a few, really thinking about just cause for eviction, that just because the neighborhood is transitioning doesn't mean that you should not be in the neighborhood that you've been in maybe all of your life. Ensuring that there are fair rents, that there's code enforcement so that you are living in a healthy home, really thinking about if you speak up that there aren't retaliations, of course, from a racial equity perspective, ensuring that there is not discrimination in the process so that everybody can enjoy the neighborhoods that they love. I also just want to highlight some emerging preservation proposals and funds that have been created. One of them is actually still being fought for in Chicago by the amazing folks at Lucha. And this is an example, the 606 Affordable Housing Preservation Ordinance, and is an example of the impact of what green infrastructure, park and open space can do to a community if there are not strategies put in place. the 606 Trail is an amazing amenity and benefit for folks in the Logan Square neighborhood, but the rents continue to increase, and being able to develop preservation or demolition fees are examples in which you might be able to create a fund that allows that there is an affordable housing trust that can be pulled from to develop more affordable housing. And the folks at Berkeley have actually passed their own ordinance. Chicago's still working on it, but I wanted to make sure that I called it out. And then also a great way is we don't have to always just rely on the public sector. Being able to look to philanthropic leaders and also some of the business leaders could be another way to think about how you secure the tax base and the homeowners in a community. And one of those examples is in Atlanta. They developed an anti-displacement tax fund in, I believe, 2017 that is focused on the west side of Atlanta that is getting ready to get into the next phase of the Beltline, which again is an amazing benefit, park and open space trail for residents that connects 47 neighborhoods. But again, without being able to ensure that there are resources, policies in place, could potentially lead to displacement. And so the tax fund is meant to support residents who may not be able to afford the rising property taxes to benefit from the fund and keeping them in place. Now, you've heard a lot from both Christopher and I, and I just wanted to highlight a few critical steps that both advocates and practitioners can take to understanding the impact of opportunity zones. I think one of the most critical things that you need to do is understand your state, your region, your city's position on opportunity zones. For some places, it's the greatest thing and they're ready to sell their city, and that's great for them, maybe. But for others, they don't know what to do. And so you might be able to really help to guide and shape the conversations by being able to be part of the radical imagination. We've never seen this much money or this potential opportunity of resource and investments go into a community in the way that it has. Previous opportunity zones or versions of this, like urban enterprise zones and others that were created in both the 80s and 90s, at max reached a number of no more than 130. We're at 8,700. That is dangerous if there are not mechanisms in place. But being able to understand how it can be dangerous, and it can also be an opportunity. And being able to think about what you can put in place is important. So one of the most important things that you should do is actually identify where the opportunity zones are in your community or your neighborhood and understand the neighborhood boundaries. Because the census tract follows people and not jurisdictions, you might be thinking that you are in an opportunity zone, but your neighbor may not, depending on how the lines were cut. So knowing your census tract is going to be important, and knowing who's in and who's out is just as important as well. Another critical aspect is being able to use data to your benefit and map the community assets and public investments that are in and around the opportunity zone boundaries. Essentially, for this opportunity zone's vision to be a benefit, people actually have to make a profit. And so as part of that, it means that there has to be an increase of investment that is happening that may spur greater investment into an area. So understanding both the community assets and the public investments, whether it's a light rail that may be coming into that area, whether it's a park and open space, whether it's a transit investment, maybe it's a BRT line, is critical for understanding both the challenges and the opportunities and the benefits that can come from investment in that targeted neighborhood. And then the other thing that I would say is really research available incentives. In order for this to work, as Christopher explained, you actually have to stack various different incentives to make a deal work. And so understanding what incentives are available to developers that may actually interest them in wanting to invest in your neighborhood is critical. Being able to understand the zoning restrictions or zoning land use policies are critical to understanding what can be built in your area and then understanding what to advocate for. Another key piece that I think advocates and practitioners should really think about is being able, if you are interested in leveraging opportunity zones, to develop a pipeline of community-driven projects and plans. So I've spoken about some of the scary things that can happen and why you have to have land use policies, strategies, and an integrated approach placed into a neighborhood, but this could also be really beneficial. For many communities, I often say every community has a plan, but what they actually lack is the capital to actually build out their plan. And so opportunity zones presents the opportunity for capital investment in your neighborhood and being able to develop out the various ideas, pipelines, projects that haven't been able to get the right amount of investment is a great way to start thinking about how opportunity zones can benefit you. And as Christopher said, one of the most critical deadlines that's coming up is December 31st, 2019. So anyone who's really trying to make a real deal is looking for great projects. And to the extent that you're able to work with your city housing department or economic development arm, you can actually leverage the opportunity zones to ensure that your plans, your projects can actually potentially get funded. Being able to understand the neighborhood's readiness for an investment is just as critical as well. Not every opportunity zone is the same, as Christopher shared in our report. And so some neighborhoods have already priced out. Some neighborhoods are just right. And some neighborhoods may not benefit from this, if we're being honest. And I think being able to understand your community's both political readiness, financial readiness, and protection readiness is critical to ensure that the market can bear the long-term pressures that can come. Remember, this is a 10-year outlook. So many people often say, my neighborhood isn't gentrifying, it's not a problem. Not yet. No one thought that in neighborhoods across the country. So make sure that there are land use policies put in place that really think about what may be coming, and also ensure that you're getting the right type of investment for your neighborhood. The other piece is being able to align the investments in the projects with local, regional, state, federal funding that's happening. Things like the build, things like Build, formerly known as Tiger, is a great example, or community development block grants, or working with your local community development financial institution like LISC, like Enterprise, like Lyft, to maybe secure Section 4 dollars to hold properties now in a qualified opportunity fund while the market is in transition. Another key piece is identifying resources, grants, subsidies that can support those pieces. And finally, being able to monitor and report outcomes. One of the critical aspects of the opportunity zones was the designation. Once the governors made that designation, that was all that they really had to say about it. They now have to put in their own mechanisms. Every state has to put in their own mechanisms for how they're going to leverage opportunity zones. And the thing about the designation is it can't be changed. So those opportunity zones are going to be the opportunity zones of today will be the same opportunity zones 10 years from now in terms of the jurisdictional lines. My final piece before I close is really thinking about key questions that you should ask yourself if you're interested in advancing a project in an opportunity zones, or if you are thinking about potential plans for an opportunity zones. And the first one is really, how are you co-creating and integrating equity considerations? Is the investment that you're getting ready to make in alignment with the neighborhood plans? This is critical because I think developers will still probably have to go through the permitting process, and you're going to have to maybe potentially go to the planning board or zoning board, depending on the type of investment. And if that's the case, really understanding if the community has buy-in would be critical to ensure that the project can move more quickly. Also really thinking about, have you engaged the right community voice, the right community leaders as part of it, thinking about who might be impacted by the investment is just as important. And then one of the things that we often ask ourselves within Spark is who will benefit and who will be burdened by the investment. And I think that this is critical for everything that we do. Oftentimes when we develop out policies, we don't think about the unintended consequences. So really thinking about how you might be able to reduce the burden if there is going to be one, identifying maybe key groups or stakeholders that may be left out, and thinking about how you address some of those pieces. And then the final piece that I would say is really thinking about how you're integrating greater local affordability, improving the health outcomes, and increasing sustainability. I'm looking forward to questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephanie. Throughout the webinar, we've been assembling the questions posed by our audience, and we will now move into the question and answer session. Gotten quite a few of them already. You can continue to submit questions as we move into the discussion, and we'll answer as many as we can till about 2:30 Eastern. And I think, as we did last time, we'll ask Christopher and Stephanie to put their webcams on so we can make this a little bit more interactive. The first question is to you, Christopher. Okay, the Opportunity Zone program is federally facilitated but locally led. Which communities or states are doing a good job of handling and landing investments along with community benefits agreements or other value-added tools for local neighborhoods?
There are a number of communities that I would say are on the front end or have been really best practices. First and foremost, I would call out the city of Newark, New Jersey, who, interesting enough, prior to Opportunity Zones, were engaging in the Amazon HQ2 discussion. And what they learned through that process was that as they were trying to attract this massive economic development mammoth, that being Amazon, that their local community, their local neighborhoods were not on board. And so they went through their own internal processes of developing equitable development growth plans for each of their neighborhoods, which actually has put them in a better position now that Opportunity Zones has come online. And I say that to say one of the realizations of the Opportunity Zone incentive is that for communities that have been really doing a lot of the hard work over the last 10, 15, 20 years in this space, have found themselves best positioned to not only market themselves and invest, but do it with level of confidence from the community, given the fact that they've been doing a lot of work. And so in many ways, the story of Newark is, if you are particularly one of those communities that are in an attractive opportunity zone and you have not done the hard work of doing that neighborhood community development plan, then you are definitely backfooted and you have to spend a lot more time building the level of confidence both with the community as well as the overall investment community that these things would turn out. Secondly, I will also point to the state of California. So for those who may be aware, there are about 36 states across the country who have conformity laws for the federal tax law. So essentially, if the federal government gives you a tax break on, let's say, student loans, or in this case, capital gains, 36 states actually conform to that law. Unfortunately, there are quite a few that do not. And California, Michigan, New Jersey, and a number of others across the country, North Carolina, are now debating within their state legislatures how they should structure their state capital gains tax incentives to support. So in the example of California, most recently, the governor, with a strong bipartisan support, essentially said for those opportunity funds that are investing in the state of California, in order to take advantage of the California state capital gain tax incentive, you have to invest in affordable housing, you have to invest around transit, and more importantly, when you do invest and register as a corporation within the state, you have to declare where you're investing, you have to provide more transparency. And so in many ways, that's just an example of how local governments are working on the ground using pretty much community engagement as a form of a regulatory framework of how to create those strategies that Stephanie talked about, as well as how state governments are engaging. I think the biggest lesson we're learning here is that while the federal government did not put in place those transparency and community benefit requirements, local and state governments have the ability to fill that void and vacuum.
Yeah, and I would just echo not just Newark, New Jersey, but also the state of New Jersey. They have developed actually a community asset map that lists out all of their infrastructure assets around opportunity zones, which is a great way to really think about what are the investments that are happening in a community. Another great example is the state of Minnesota. In developing out their opportunity zones, they actually worked very collaboratively with both the CDFIs, the Community Development Financial Institutions, the local nonprofit groups on the ground to identify the opportunity zones that has needed investment but haven't been able to unlock it. And so they thought way ahead of some of the other folks who are really thinking about the location and also the opportunity that could be leveraged.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie. Another question is, how are qualified opportunity funds established? Who is taking the lead on this, the public or private sector, and does this differ by state or county?
Great question. So one of the key elements about this tax incentive of opportunity funds, the creation of opportunity funds, was actually creating a low barrier of entry for investors. So of course you may think of equity fund managers at Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan who handle billions, if not trillions of dollars every year investing in real estate. But the idea was for regular Joe American, Susan American, who may have a land asset or have a business that they want to sell and they want to reinvest in their community. And so in essence, the way one would go about creating an opportunity fund is literally a IRS form declaration. So if you have that land asset or that business and you sell it and you gain that capital gain, you have 180 days to fill out a form to create a corporation. Literally, you can go to LegalZoom.com, create an LLC, or partner with another business to then actually transfer those resources into that fund. Now, that piece is managed and regulated by the IRS. And so just recently, for the last year and a half, IRS have been putting out a series of guidelines and regulatory frameworks for those opportunity funds, but it simply is a form that you filled out that confirms that those assets that you just sold are now being held by the corporation. But one of the things to keep in mind is that these opportunity funds, right now by statute, in terms of legislation, do not have to report any additional information to state governments or local governments or community activists. Most recently, I will say that last week, Treasury, the deadline for additional comments on whether or not what information should IRS, who now has all this information or collecting this information, do with that. And so Smart Group America and a number of other organizations really submit a lot of comments to suggest that IRS provide not only where opportunity funds are being designated and located, what type of assets, what type of development projects that they're producing or creating. So that's one of the things I think people should keep in mind of. Definitely should be contacting their members of Congress to really put pressure on IRS to follow through with those comments.
Thank you. Okay, another question here is, can you provide examples of or suggestions for the types of projects that could encourage investment in maintaining and preserving the existing affordable housing stock?
I will take a step of using one of Stephanie's examples because we are actually having a similar conversation. So one of the things that we're beginning to realize is that there are a number of strategies in terms of creating affordable housing in opportunity zones and primarily leveraging different assets, particularly from the local community. So for example, there are a group of developers and an opportunity fund in the city of Detroit, or actually operating out of the city of Detroit, but are looking who's looking to work throughout the entire Midwest they're looking to create ADU business. And so instead of actually creating, going in and building the building itself, it's actually creating the entire opportunity fund that will actually support the entire ecosystem of an ADU. So the construction workers, the actual supplies, and the like. That's one example. Another strategy for this particular firm are trying to work with the city of Detroit, who has CDBG dollars. And essentially, as they're looking to go through these neighborhoods to potentially bring these ADU units, they're also asking the city to use their CDBG to do retrofits of existing homeowners. So right now, one of the qualifications, eligibilities within CDBG is to actually go and actually do rehab for low-income houses that, you know, hey, grandmother's roof is not needs fixing, or you want to make their building more ADA compliant. And so basically partnering and layering those local dollars on private investment really is just another strategy of, and as Stephanie pointed out, and that we've been saying a lot, is a moment for us to take a radical reimagination of how do we bring affordable housing to these communities by re-leveraging and reimagining the resources that we have. So those are just two examples of how a opportunity fund with a developer are trying to embrace the ADU industry while at the same time leveraging the local government CDBG dollars to go in and actually help local residents repair their substandard housing or improve those housing so that they can actually stay in place.
Yeah, one of the initiatives that we have at NRDC is called Energy Efficiency for All. That's really helping to support multifamily reuse. One of the things about the Opportunity Zone is not just the land, but also a business. So job creation is a great tool that we can use in being able to ensure that not only are we training the next generation, but even the current one. My colleague, Julia Prushnik, just did a great Opportunity Zone blog at NRDC, really focusing on how you support a just energy transition, looking at opportunity zones. A lot of what we talked about was really focused on housing, but I mean, you can truly layer any type of public investment to really get a profit from it. I would also maybe call out inclusionary zoning. So really being able to think about how for any development that is done, being able to have a set aside for moderate, low income, extremely low income residential units as part of that development building could be one of those pieces.
Okay, thank you. Another question here. To what extent does this work intersect with community health and human services? This would seem, especially given the neuroscience related to toxic stress among folks who live in challenging neighborhoods, including the risk of displacement.
Yeah, so I would highly recommend that you check out my colleague Sasha Forbes' blog on tenant protections. She does a really great job of highlighting some of the health benefits, really also just thinking about as we do rehabs and upgrades to homes, being able to ensure that the toxic building materials that might have been in there from the 1970s and others could be leveraged. One of the great examples that I would call out is in Memphis. Oh, green, it'll come to me. But essentially really thinking about how you leverage the health sector, and they're working with Le Bonheur which is the children's hospital in North Memphis, to support upgrades to the homes of the communities there. I'd also highlight my colleague, Melissa Jones. She's with Bar High, the Bay Area Health Inequities Initiative, that's leveraging both the public, leveraging the public health officers and also the hospital investments in those areas to really think about how they leverage their own investments in the neighborhoods around that they're serving. And most hospitals have done a community needs assessment. Some of them have undertaken the notion of really thinking about how you address the social determinants of health by investing in community, and have their own arms that have been looking at how they invest in and around. And so I think Bar High would be a great example. Archie, which is based in Atlanta, could be another great example of really thinking about those pieces. And I would also call out RWJ, Robert Wood Johnson, Barnabas Health in New Jersey. They've done some incredible work, particularly in Newark, Beth Israel, thinking about investment in and around the communities that they're serving.
Okay. Can you tell us more about transit-oriented development opportunities for opportunity zones? Would these have to be public-private partnerships? Do you have any examples?
Sure. There are a number of ways that opportunity funds can support transit-oriented development, and I think in this case, how to support equitable TOD. And I know for a couple of examples I can give, in New Jersey, in East Orange, there is a opportunity fund capitalized by Capital One, by Goldman Sachs, working with a local developer who, in partnership with the city of East Orange, are taking an existing brownfield site at a New Jersey transit station and converting it as well as along with a existing strip mall type grocery store anchor into a mixed use development. What was interesting about that particular project is that the project now, the opportunity funds allow the developer a longer time horizon to do some of the brownfield redevelopment before the state was able to secure additional funding. In addition to that, the dollars are more patient than your traditional investment dollars that are out there in the capital market. So by having that level of flexibility, one of the big challenges we always have with transit-oriented development is that you need a longer horizon to actually make these projects pencil. Now, on the city side, they actually did a lot of the hard work to ensure, as they were putting some of their public incentives like tax abatement and the like, they included in the project, include over 20% of the housing units that were going to be included would be dedicated to a 80% AMI, as well as that 90% of the construction jobs, as well as the vendors that supports those construction jobs and the build out the development would be locally sourced. And so that's just an example of how an opportunity fund comes in and could support on the short-term basis, but also be able to leverage a lot of the public incentives around it. There are a number of others out there, but I think one of the biggest challenges we're still seeing around TOD projects as it pertains to opportunity zones, and particularly opportunity funds that are interested in investing around transit, is that it really requires the transit agency, the local government, the community groups to be on the same page. Because if you're an investor who sees a great economic opportunity at a transit stop to do TOD, if there's a likelihood that the project doesn't fall through after 31 months, which is a IRS requirement for you to, when you deploy your dollars in that area, that you have to actually get into a project, that if it's possible that the community group comes back at 31 months or the city backs out, you can get a potential tax penalty. And so in that essence, TOD projects across the country have to really be clear about the timeline that it will take to get that project off the ground. So I'll just highlight that's one key element about whether or not a TOD deal is good or not. But just knowing that while it's true, do not be so concerned about the mad rush to the first door that's opening up with opportunity zones in terms of December 2019. Given the fact that TOD projects do take a longer timeline, the fact is, and the fact of the matter is, the research is borne out, if you're investing in TOD projects, 10 years from now, you're gonna be making a lot more money in terms of price premiums and rents, hopefully done the right way, than your driverless suburban counterpart. And from the real estate market, the question you have to ask yourself if you're a TOD investor or any investor, which product, whether it's multifamily, housing, commercial, or smart deal, would more likely be sold in 10 years? And it's our view that it's less likely that there will be a huge market or appetite for more driverless suburban development than those that are TOD. So the market for TOD is really bright for opportunity zone investments.
And I would, again, on the Spark website, we have a full report issue brief that spotlights how you implement equitable transit-oriented development. I would offer another way to think about how you could do TOD, highlighting the city of Tyler, Texas. So they acquired a building near the transit station with the Federal Transit Administration's assistance. In 2016, I believe, the property was no longer needed. And so they have actually created an innovation lab that both public and nonprofit sector folks can use. And so I think that is an example of where you could use both joint development of a transit investment or a public investment to support a community need for an area, and it allows you to leverage both the business side and the land use side of the opportunity zone.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. Given the volume of questions, we may go over a couple minutes if that works for you too.
Sure.
Thank you. A couple questions came in about rural areas, about whether there are organizations that are working rurally, and then another question here is, can you either of you speak on approaches and plans in rural opportunity zones where priorities may be different and projects may tend toward infrastructure, such as solar farms as opposed to housing?
I love that question. Thank you, whoever asked that question. Because one of the things that we realized when we did our opportunity zone report, and I'll admit it was intentional, that it was a clear sign if someone would say, well, I do not see any small towns or rural places on the top 100 list. And what was really one of the fascinating things about that is when we looked into data, particularly when you got outside of the top 100 or 200 metros across the country, and really were looking only at rural places, that still rural places that had great walkability, great access to job density, and mixes of uses actually fared better than rural communities that did not have those in terms of investment. And so in many ways, what we were hoping for, and particularly I think what we're beginning to see, is that for smaller places, rural town also can be participatory in the conversation, but also recognizing that their best land use, best value of use of the land may be actually away from real estate investment. It may be in the energy sector. A lot of we're seeing working with the Rural Investment Center at Georgetown. There are a number of investment funds that are interested in expanding agricultural property in those places. And so ag tech is another element that we're beginning to see come up. Of course, as you pointed out earlier, solar tech, solar panels and green energy, the clean economy is a major opportunity for rural areas. And I say that to say is that is the element and one of the innovations that opportunity zones bring, because it allows local communities to actually, as Stephanie had pointed out, take a stock of their local assets, whether it's their downtown Main Street, whether it's their local anchor institutions, or the fact that they are a major, agricultural or potential energy producer. And the issue we're finding now is, and this is a recommendation I'll find, is that yes, it's true that rural communities are beginning to think about how do we bring ourselves to the national discussion. And so organizations like Smart America and a number of others are beginning to create rural investment forms where rural mayors, project sponsors can actually submit those. Secondly, we're also finding that rural communities are beginning to partner with each other, because oftentimes you may have a situation, one of the biggest challenges we're beginning to see, unlike other tax credits or other federal programs, is the lack of capacity. And so we're seeing now a number of foundations begin to provide technical assistance to help those smaller rural places not only begin to think through the strategies that we talked about before, but actually package those projects in such a way and potentially cross-pollinate or aggregate those projects at a national level. So for those who are interested, please definitely reach out. We're beginning to roll something like that in the second quarter of this year, third quarter of this year, and definitely would love to keep that conversation going.
And one of the things that I would maybe encourage you to check out is the Partnership for Sustainable Communities. When it was around, developed this amazing federal resource guide that highlights all of the grants that are available for rural communities. For the most part, they're still very much available and up to date. So I'd encourage you to check that out to really think about how you blend the funds that are part of it. And I believe that Locus actually did an update of the federal grants that are available and programs that are available, I think in 2018, for folks to be able to access. Because again, this is going to be a capital stack that you have to do. So you're going to have to blend multiple funds. Oh, and I would,
go ahead.
Okay. No, I was going to say, and the only other thing, just putting on my transit hat, I would encourage you to also look at the Rural Transit Assistance Program, RTAP, which is a great tool for really thinking about how you leverage the transportation investments or needs for a rural community.
And I just want to add one thing, and this really goes to the investor conversation. A rural mayor at our last year conference, we were we have a coalition here at Smart for America called First in Maine, which are primarily small and rural mayors across the country who are interested in smart growth. And we brought them to DC last year. We're bringing them again this year. For those who are interested in participating, please let us know. Conference in 2 weeks here in DC. But one of the mayors there, rural mayors, said, Christopher, I know I can't get Goldman Sachs. I know I can't get JP Morgan. I know I can't get these big players. How the heck can I get investment in my local community? And I looked at it, he said he had a town less than 2,000 people. I said, Mayor, I assume you have a tax assessor, so because someone has to pay tax. And he said, absolutely. I would call my tax assessor tomorrow and ask he or she to bring in the top 10 property owners of the tax based on their tax rolls into your conference room, or your top 10 campaign donors and to your room, because I largely believe that they will have resources. And one of the things that we have to be mindful of, particularly, is about scale. So while Newark's or the DCs or the Baltimores are looking at millions, if not billions of dollars of potential investment opportunity, we know this, $100,000 dedicated to a rural downtown, cleaning up streets, creating infrastructure companies that will plant trees and the like, can actually be a huge catalyst for economic development in rural main streets and rural downtowns. And so from that standpoint, again, just to let folks know, the point of the tax incentive is not for this to be a conversation about the people who have the most money, but the fact that all of us, even in our smallest towns, and that, long-lasting business may have an interest in investing in their backyard, and this provides them an opportunity to do that if you only create the opportunity.
I really want to echo that, because a lot of the, we are often looking to other people for the solutions that are within us. And I think the reason why I started off with ADUs and some of the other examples where those were locally led solutions. And again, the benefit of the opportunity zones is that you don't need a big investor. It may just take you and a couple of neighbors to come together and say that we want to make our community better. And that within itself is an amazing resource for communities to really think about how to leverage.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. Just a couple more questions before we close. I'm in similar vein. Are there existing or emerging resources for opportunity zones located in rural Native American communities whose dynamic and needs may vary greatly from dense populations with less access to jobs and transit, et cetera? Rather, you want to take that one? Oh, Stephanie muted.
Great, yes. I am looking for it now. It's actually NAFIO. So for the tribal, to answer the tribal question, there is a group out in, I will tell you in 1 second. It's NAFOA, and if you just Google Opportunity Zones Resource Network, they have focused on the investments for opportunity zones in Native American lands, and they have some resources that you can be able to reach them and find as part of it.
And just be mindful, one of the elements about the overall, particularly as it pertains to tribal, at the federal level, we're increasingly finding that whether it's the Department of Interior and HHS and others are also asking themselves a simple question of how can they repurpose or redefine some of the grants and loan programs and engagement on the ground. So I will also encourage folks to look out to some new grant dollars that are becoming available, and also technical assistant capacity, whether through Interior and also through the Department of HUD, that are now being made available to local community groups or organizations and investors who are thinking about how to invest in tribal communities and tribal governments.
Okay. Do people have to pay the capital gains taxes at 7 years, or can they wait till the 10-year mark?
Great question. So if you literally, you have to pay your capital gains tax on December 31st, 2026. So at that point, everyone, no matter where you are in your time horizon, you are required to pay that tax, which is why, as Stephanie pointed out earlier, why a lot of investors are trying to move now to get the best, the highest potential benefit of the tax incentive by having the 7-year delay deferral. But yes, everyone has to pay the tax in year 2026.
Okay. Are you aware of any closed opportunity zones? If so, have case studies been produced?
Very good question. There have been a number of opportunity zone projects that have closed, but have not gotten to the place where we're able to do a objective analysis of impact and structure. But we do have examples of fund structures and prototypes in terms of project prototypes. But in terms of things that we've gleaned thus far, a lot of the initial funds that have been created were for existing projects that were already underway, and the project sponsor and their capital source, or in that case, the equity partner, were decided to do a restructuring of the overall project to take advantage. But I think the next wave of projects that are closing at the end of this year will give us a larger swath of projects and for us to glean some best practices.
Okay. Just, I guess, two last questions. Why did you mention 2026 as an exit timestamp and 2041? If I buy a building in 2024, can I hold the asset past the 2026 deadline to 2036?
Absolutely. So one of the things that you should think about and understand that there are key dates, and I wish I had the slide earlier to help better articulate. But as Stephanie pointed out, this is a 10-year program. So once it gets to December 2026, all opportunity zone investments, those capital gains that would have been subjected to a capital gain tax, have to pay the tax. However, you can still hold your investment in that community past 2026 all the way to 2041 before you can take advantage of the 10-year plus capital gain exclusion. So in essence, for those who are fund managers or who are in this space, recognize that oftentimes if you have a fund that has multiple assets, so you may have a building, you may have a business, you may have some other business tangible property, all being held by the fund, that it may take more than 10 years past the expiration date of the opportunity zone designations to actually unwind the fund. So in this essence, and based on the recent Treasury guidelines, fund managers who have multiple assets have until 2041 to unwind those funds, sell off those assets to obtain that 10-year or that capital gain exclusion. So again, your initial tax liability and your initial gain is due in 2026, but your capital gain exclusion on anything you made above that initial investment can be held until 2041, and at that point in time, you've had to unwind that asset in order to get the federal tax benefit.
Okay. Stephanie, well, one question was, what was that grant program that you just mentioned for rural communities? Could you tell us that one again?
RTAP, the Rural Transportation Assistance Program run by the Federal Transit Administration.
Gotcha. Okay. So one last question here. Would it make sense for someone to invest capital gains into a not-for-profit like Habitat for Humanity to build a 20-unit affordable housing project, for example? Would the investor have the potential to get any return on investment since it's not a not-for-profit?
So that is a brilliant question, largely because the answer is for an organization like Habitat for Humanity or other community development organizations that have a 501c3, now is a great time for them to repurpose or create for-profit subsidiaries that can now actually obtain these dollars. And so in many cases, we're finding that for affordable housing projects, the investor may not find it profitable in terms of getting the right investment returns just doing an affordable housing deal, putting the money in a capital stack, but if they actually invest in an affordable housing business that is managed by, let's say, a Habitat or a social impact investor, that the business itself, because the business could potentially do affordable housing projects, do other community benefit projects as well, and that the investment returns there may be one that's attractive to an investor. And so in that instance, I think there's two things you should understand from a fund or investor perspective. One, if you want to partner with local organizations, one of the things you should do on the front end is create a for-profit company for those local institutions to participate. And number two, as part of the fund management, you should incorporate or encourage those nonprofit organizations to take be a part of the fund management group that actually oversees or reviews investments in their local community. So the local organization can also get what we call a fund management fee. So while they may not be on the development side, but the fact that they are participatory and managing the fund, they also can get a new round of revenue. So I highly encourage nonprofit organizations to explore the idea of creating their subsidiaries that can actually attract these investments to further their mission, as well as encourage investors to incorporate nonprofits into their fund management. That not only allows from a confidence building standpoint for the community, but also to ensure that these nonprofits who are real community assets can also thrive as investments come and pour into those communities.
Completely agree.
Okay. I guess one last question. Do you know of any B corporations active in this space?
That would be the equivalent. Well, so I don't know, but that would be the equivalent to what Christopher is describing. That's
Gotcha.
And right now we have not seen, we've seen a number of corporations, both your traditional corp and also B corps, going to this space. One of the things that a lot of corporations are deciding, and this is one of the key elements that people have to realize, is that existing corporations may position themselves as a qualified opportunity zone business. Given the fact they already have incorporated in their corporate structure a social equity or a community benefit apparatus or mission. Now, one of the biggest challenges that corporations who are B Corp are facing is how do they make sure that they maintain or become certified as a qualified opportunity zone business. And there are a couple of key thresholds on that. Number one, if you are a business, even if you're a B Corp or not B Corp, but particularly for those if you're a B Corp, you have to ensure that at least 50% of your operations, your wages, or the independent contractors that are working for that business are working in opportunity zone communities across the country or working in projects. So you may have an existing B Corp who says, look, we've been working in an opportunity zone all our lives. We can, for those B Corps that are not, they may identify or create a subsidiary that allows them to do that more effectively. But I think that is also applicable to all corporations, LLCs out there as well. So.
Okay, so I have to run, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for the opportunity.
And thank you both. With that, we'll conclude our webinar today, Unlocking Opportunity Zones for Equitable Outcomes. I'd like to offer a big thank you to Christopher and Stephanie for a great presentation and to all those who attended. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on the smartgrowth.org website later this week. You'll be able to find it on our webinar archives page. Keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and our weekly e-newsletter for details on future webinars, including the next one, which will be this Thursday on urban freeway demolition, entitled Remove a Highway, Improve a City, featuring former Milwaukee Mayor and Congress for the New Urbanism President John Norquist. Have a great day.